They were freedom in the New World. And then here on the right side, the successionists, the artists who rebelled against academic rules of art and the art establishment, and they were seeking their own personal vision. Now, people ask me if the photo on the, let's see, you're right, was taken in Zoar. I always say yes, but actually I don't know. So don't hold me too much of account. The two groups were kindred spirits in that both were seeking an unspoiled place, free from the intrusions of the modern, ugly industrial world. They both sought a simpler way of life, where one could focus on the fundamental spiritual basis of life. I'm going to try and coordinate both this and this. Now, on one hand, the Zoar paintings can be certainly appreciated for just their beauty alone. There's no question. But as part of the talk today, I'd like to go a little further and note that in an age of war that we have now, pandemic, social upheaval, our interest is drawn to a simpler way of life. Now, there's an American tradition, beginning with the American Indians and the Plymouth Pilgrims, wherein groups and families seek to live in harmony with nature. There's a desire to recover in the wilderness the honest life rooted in farming and focus on different beliefs. Many rebelled and wanted to follow their own spiritual course, their own relationship with God. And if they did not comply, oftentimes they were flogged and sometimes jailed. They needed to petition in those days, we're talking about the 1800s, to leave the monarchy. Finally, and I've never heard really why the monarch relented, but he did allow 300 to immigrate to the US. Joseph Bimler led the group and was able shrewdly to purchase 5,500 acres along the Tuscarora River. And that became the Zoar colony. They picked this site and named the town Zoar, which I always think is so interesting. Comes from Genesis, and it's the city where Lot had been permitted refuge during his flight from Sodom. They laid down this wonderful grid, and they put their European knowledge to work constructing the first cabins. They needed to form a cooperative commune, since there were only 50 men, 150 women, and then the rest were children. So really everyone had to work. But through hard work, they thrived, and within a dozen years were able to pay off the loan that they had made to buy the land. Work was held in the highest esteem, with the women performing the same tasks. Sundays were devoted for worship. And fortunately, in 1827, the Ohio and Erie Canal decided to build next to the colony, and this brought a great amount of income. Unfortunately, which we'll talk about, with the prosperity came a series of problems. Now, in the early days, and I think, ooh, how did I do that? I didn't mean that. I think many of you know the Zoar artists. There were many craftsmen living in Zoar, including furniture makers, tinsmiths, weavers, but we only know one visual artist, which was Thomas Mayer. And he did a series of religious ink and watercolor drawings. And also these brightly colored floral designs that decorate the village chests and sometimes wardrobes. And some of them, as you go around the village, you will see. Now, going back to where things started with the academic school, if you think of the paintings of Rembrandt and the Dutch school with the dark backgrounds, dark browns, dark blacks, broad brush strokes like Frans Hals, portraits which were very realistic. This was the style of painting, really up to the early 1800s. And this is a painting of Alexander Gunn, and there's a series of photographs. Here he is in his garden. He was a Cleveland wealthy businessman. That this is something I've talked with people in the literature, in the newspapers. We can't find any information about him. It only describes him as a wealthy industrialist, wealthy businessman, but he was up in Cleveland. What exactly he was doing? Was he in industry, in the steel business, in oil? Was he in commerce? If anyone ever finds anything out, I'd love to find it, because we've researched it thoroughly. And it's interesting because in those days, they actually made books every 10 years of the notable inhabitants of the area. He does not show up there. But we know from the parties, he was very connected with the art community, and also some of the wealthy industrialists. He had them down to his cabin, which he called the Hermitage. And he lived here from 1879 to 1901. And here's the Hermitage, and some of you, if not all, are very familiar with this cabin. This is a later painting from 1920 that Ely did, and just a wonderful, expressive motif. There's the Hermitage. Aha. Now we play a game. Can all of you see this fairly well? And you see the painting over there? What's the difference? The people. This is kind of interesting. We're fortunate where we live. When I was setting up the exhibit 6 years ago, a friend of mine, Betsy, said, you know, I have a painting I found in it. Really, it wasn't even an estate, it was someone selling the contents of their house. It's pretty worn, but it says Zoar on it. Do you think it's a Zoar? It's named Blanche Sanders. What's nice is the plain dealer has everything in line, so I looked her up, and lo and behold, it describes her as a member of Gottwald's summer art program at Zoar. They had an exhibit in Cleveland, and they listed all the artists. And it was in bad condition. She had it restored, and we were very thrilled to find it. Now, as things happened for the 2 years leading up to the exhibit in the bicentennial in 2017, I almost said 1917, 2017, I could not find a work by Gottwald, even though he'd spent 20 years coming down here at Zoar. There were nice paintings he did in Holland, some paintings he did when he visited Italy, nothing by him. Last year, lo and behold, at the auction, what shows up but this? And at first I thought, oh, Betsy put it up for auction. So I looked and said, that's a different painting. That has girls, and that's signed by Gottwald. So here we have a picture of the art expert, the teacher. And this, we think, takes place across from the boarding house for the boys dormitory. And you can see the similarity and differences. Now, the one thing I'm thinking of, and there are two questions here. One is, it's easier painting flowers and buildings than people. So that was a little beyond her. So she did not try in this painting to do the picture. the portrait of the girls. The second thing we know, that the artist hired the children of the community for 25 cents a day, which still amazes me because I grew up in the 50s, and even in the 50s, 25 cents was a lot of money. You could do a lot of things in terms of food, comics, whatever. But that's listed. So I don't know if they actually allowed their children to be models, or if the women in the exhibit in the summer school took turns modeling. But it's interesting to see here, on one hand, the teacher Gottwald. Now, if you think of the classical way the artist is supposed to be portrayed in the late 1800s, that's Gottwald in the studio with the beret and the smock and the easel and how it's going. Now, Gottwald was called Gotti by his students. He taught up in Cleveland at the Cleveland, then known as School of Art, from 1885 to 1926. He was born in Vienna. He was an academic painter who learned from the Royal Academy in Munich, and only later became radicalized, if you call it that, doing impressionistic landscapes, which were considered very radical in the day. And that's with some subdued colors, but you still have very clearly defined architecture in the buildings, and a three-dimensional look. Now, the one thing I skipped over, going back to Alexander Dunn, he did keep a diary. And there, I thought it was kind of wonderful. He listed why he thought he came down here, and he was the first individual that the colony allowed to live on grounds. And he wrote in his diary, "For in the life of this kindly people, shut out from the hard world and sheltered by the circle of hills surrounding the village, there is little to attract the world. Here come faintly the echoes of the strife. Well was it named Zoar, the place of rest. Here too I come and find sanctuary from the clamors and empty ambitions of the world." Unfortunately, this really opened the door to a lot of the enticements of the world, and it would have some dramatic effects on the colony, but much later. The Zoar Summer School of Art, it was founded in the 1880s. And I want to mention, this is from the newspaper. We take for granted nowadays all the advertising we have on all sorts of mixed media. But if you go back in the 1800s, and even the early 1900s, there's no radio, there's no television. Really, all you have is these colored lithographs to really give pictures of things. And all that the newspapers could do is do etching. So these would be actual oil paintings. And in order to show them, reproduce them in the newspapers, they would do these kind of etchings. This shows the village of Zoar, and here it's an evening in Zoar. If you can see it, the farmer is with the horse giving him some feed at the end of the day, and gives us a picture of the life at the time. Now, in the 1880s, artists began spending summers in Zoar. They were attracted to the exceptional beauty, and there were two main teachers, Frederick Gottwald, who we talked about, and Aura Colton, who will come up in a minute. They were both teachers at the Cleveland School of Art, and they began bringing students down for a 10-week instruction in oil and watercolor painting. This newspaper article describes Zoar as a favorite spot. The original church, here we are today, was used as a studio and classroom. So that's what's kind of remarkable, that we do some time traveling. Here we're talking about something from 100, 150 years ago, but sitting in the actual spots that it all took place. Now, as I mentioned, the project had the support of the community, and the children were freed from the daily chores to assist the artists. If they would go out, they would have to take buckets of water, their umbrellas for the sun, their chairs, and whatever, and help them carry, and possibly also to do to do modeling. I moved the two things. This is a picture of Gottwald's compatriot, or Waldman, and no matter how good the reproductions and slides, you can't tell the texture and the feeling of the paintings. So down below there, you can come up later, see Coltman's painting of one of the farms and the back bills, and you see it's already getting a modernistic feel, a little lighter palette than before. I wanted to mention that prosperity led to decline in the commune. It disbanded in 1898 after the death of the religious leader, Joseph Baumler, in 1853. There was gradually a loss in focus. Financial success brought new problems. There was easy access to railroads, and the hotel expanded, and it brought throngs of vacationers from the surrounding area. And for the locals, it was hard not to be dazzled by the latest fashions and the lure of the bright city ways. Now, fortunately, most of the buildings with their distinctive architecture and medieval flavor are preserved. The silent mills, the solitary apple trees, all convey a sense of the beauty of the spiritual life. This woodcut, again, is from 1897, shows two neighbors, and then back there we see the cupola from the hotel. Again, it's interesting. I like to think, as we look to my right and your left, the field. This is a painting by Adam Lear, who was a son of a German immigrant. Alexander Gunn admired Lear's work and paid for Lear to study at the Art Student League. This starts something which is very interesting in our area, which is known for its charitable work and looking after one another. And there's story after story of young children who, starting in elementary school, show a gift for being a painter and artist. And the public school teacher would hook them up with well-known artists. They would be paid for. They'd get a tuition to the Cleveland School of Art, and oftentimes then they would be paid, and we'll tell another story later, to go to New York and Europe for training. So this was Lear's case, and he was paid to study in New York, but came back to this area. It is interesting, certain artists pick certain motifs. And with Lear, he loved the open fields. Now, sometimes a field is more than a field. And his paintings, I believe, have a religious overtone. Many times you will see landscapes by other artists, and they will have 3 crosses. In this case, if you look in the distance, you can see here the 3 trees. 2 of them in the autumn already turning color, going brown. 1 stays in life. There was the motif of Christ and the crosses and of resurrection. Now, when I showed this earlier, several years ago, someone mentioned, I don't know if it's still done, when she was growing up as a little girl, she saw the haystacks stacked this way, which is an old way it was done in Germany. I don't know with modern machinery if it's done like that. But you can take these for people. And I don't know if you can see the little orange dots, pumpkins. Now we're used to pumpkins being symbol of Halloween. But if you go back to the 1880s, 1890s, they're a symbol of Thanksgiving, the blessings of God, and the rebirth. So what looks like a very simple landscape, really one can look at really as a spiritual painting. And as I say, I look out here in the field because a lot of them did not go far afield. It may very well be this field over here that he was painting. His atmosphere is wonderful. He's using bright light and color. It's really the beginning of American Impressionism. We think of ourselves as being far removed from Europe. When you study, you realize people were going back and forth all the time. It was really nothing. It was a long journey, but it was done regularly. People would come here for a while, they would go back to Europe, come settle. In 1892, a wealthy Clevelander owned not one but two Monet's paintings. The father of French Impressionism exhibited them in Cleveland. And as things go, it started this fact. And you see after this, for the next 20 years, one painting after another of Impressionist haystacks, which it goes. So it's interesting, the interconnection. Now, I apologize for my photograph here, but it was under glass and I couldn't help but the reflection. This is the old mill, and I think in the photograph you get an idea of the beautiful silver lavender colors he painted the surroundings with. This is Benjamin Kratz. He grew up in Sugar Creek, and several of his regional paintings are at Ohio Historical Society. I think this of the old mill at Zoar, painted in 1910, is one of the most beautiful. You see the silvery green and lilac colored leaves, and afternoon light really reflects in wonderful Impressionist painting. Now, I did bring this with me. It's down here, you can look at it later, small, but the texture, and this is from Cullen Yates, because in addition to Gottwald and Waldman, Cullen Yates was born in Bryan, Ohio, studied art in New York and Paris, and in the 1890s came back to this area, taught for several years at the Cleveland School of Art and the faculty, and he had a traveling summer school. So they spent a week or so in Zoar, go up to Boston and surrounding areas, and he really is known for his colorful Impressionist landscapes. And he had some very important students. And then when he moved back to New York, they followed him and studied there. This is wonderful. Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't do that. Here's Cullen Yates, the birch tree, which you can see down here. And then this is Cullen Yates' sketching class. Again, people say, is that taken at Zoar? And I say yes, and I don't know. But it gives the feel of how they were in the field, and it was quite a thing. The umbrellas aren't really for rain. It's so they're working in the shade, and also gives an even color and sense of light to the painting they're doing. This is another of Cullen Yates, and you see the Impressionist handling of the water down here, the boats, and the surrounding trees. Now, I wanted to talk about two of his students. Let me get my pages organized. who did these two paintings. And this is of the bakery. And we feel this is, we've had discussions, the wood piled up in the neighboring building. And this is one of the cabins. Now, Frary was born in Cleveland and attended the Cleveland School of Art. He is best known as the author and photographer. He included the classic, his works include the classic Early Homes of Ohio, as well as the book Thomas Jefferson, Architect and Builder. He was close friends with Hartley, and together they attended classes at the Cleveland School of Art and sketched during the summers with Cullen Yates's class. Now, the Zoar watercolor dates from 1898. We see right there the cupola of the hotel in the distance. And looking carefully, I pointed out the stacks of wood. This is interesting. This is a sketch done of Marsden Hartley. Now, Marsden Hartley is considered one of the leading figures of early American art. He came here as a teenager. His mother died and the father seeking work and family. And as a teenager, he worked at the Cleveland and the Ohio Canal. At that time, they were bringing in marble for the new buildings. And he fell in love with all the textures and designs and the feel of the marble. One day, he was wandering around Cleveland. Things were a bit different there. City Hall was in a big building, and a local artist, John Seaman, rented one of the floors for his art gallery. Marsden had to go there for business to City Hall, and then got intrigued, went upstairs, started talking to John Seaman, said he loved to learn to paint, and Seaman took him under his wings for a year as a student. He was so talented, he got him a scholarship to the Cleveland School of Art. That lasted a year. Again, he was so talented, one of the trustees then paid for him to go to New York and study. They continued supporting him. He went to Europe then in the early 1900s. And he really is credited with beginning American abstract painting around 1910. His first designs were about the American Indian, and he would organize almost like the designs of the marble. Teepees, horses, feathers, all sorts of kind of abstract images. What happened, he was studying in Germany at the outbreak of the World War I. And he was close friends with a young man who was a German cavalryman, a lancer. Now, what people did foolishly in those days, they still did cavalry charges. And his friend was killed in one of the first cavalry charges of the war. He had to come back to America because of the outbreak of the fighting. And he was so depressed by his friend's death that he did a series of abstract paintings, not showing a portrait, thinking back to what Gunn was doing, and Godwell was doing in his painting of Gunn, but of abstract signs. So it had his helmet, the sword, the battle flag, his insignia, his birth date, and things like this. And it had a tremendous influence, and people started, this is around 1910 to 20, and he became one of the foremost of American abstract painters. He stayed in close attention with his teacher at the Cleveland School of Art, Nina Waldman, and when she passed away in the 30s, came back for the funeral, and his friend, he stayed close with I.T. Frary. Again, in the summer school, we know of the reports. These were basically young men and women, early 20s, And it was kind of a college atmosphere. There was a lot of drinking at night, there was partying, and they really had a good time, and many of them stayed lifelong friends, even though they were traveling around. So the only thing we know is this is Marsden Hartley with this little college beanie in one of Cullen Yates's classes at that time. Now, the other side of it, for women, many of them had careers as teachers. Some art teachers, some other subjects. That gave them the summer off, and they were often participants in these shows. Now, some of them went far afield and went to Europe. Sometimes they went to the West Coast. Sometimes they stayed local to learn from the masters. And here is Carolyn Zoar, who was a teacher first at Ohio University and then active in Cleveland. And this is the porch of the bakery. And the society here, Zoar Village, owns it. And this is one of the houses. And they're beautiful little paintings. As I said before, these do show up at estate sales and auctions. And if you have an eye and a taste, you can find a real find. Then we come to Adamite. And we're moving forward into modernism. The early Impressionist style of Gottwald and Yates gave more to a modern approach beginning in the 19th century. There were a younger group of students typified by George Adamite. Now, Adamite was born in Memel, Germany. He studied art at the Cleveland School of Art after the family immigrated here and began spending summers in Zoar around 1912. His style shows a modern sensibility with the broad, loose strokes, unblended, overlapping colors, and all set in a rather abstract geometric design. He uses pale yellows and peaches, lavenders, pastel blues, offset by brownish greens. But there's a very much sense of power in his designs. I'd like to point out how he's dealing now with the haystacks, which in the original early paintings by people like Adam Lear are very realistic. You can almost see every blade of wheat. Here, it's a kind of impressionist interplay between color and light. You have the same thing here in terms of this wonderful contemplative painting of a farmer in his backyard. And this one is owned by Zoar Village. Here you really see how we've come a long way from the early designs like of Lear. And here the building is now flat, so are the trees. The acres are plowed almost in a geometric fashion. Now, my favorite. Ferdinand Bergdorf was born in Cleveland and received his art training at the Cleveland School of Art. His Zoar watercolors and pastels have a remarkable contemporary look and remind us both of the works of Winslow Homer and Andrew Wyeth. In Wooden Buckets, the farthest one in Zoar, he surprises the viewer in this delicate handling of the subject matter. It's the beauty of life's fleeting moments. It's captured in the simple light in which Bergdorf draws the glancing rays of light and deft brushwork of master watercolors. He, shortly after this is his student days, moved out to California. You do see often his paintings, which are highly colored, of the seacoast in California, the Arizona desert. These are the only ones I've known around here. They're owned locally. I begged to buy one. Unfortunately, was not successful. I'm sure there must be others around. If you see them, let us know. They're just wonderful, wonderful modernistic works. of art. Now we come to the star of the show, Frederick Bealey. And I can't say enough about him. Now, Bealey, and there's a portrait of him. Then you have his famous painting, The Apple Tree, The Road to Zoar with the hotel. I think, yeah. This really sums up my theme. It's interesting because while many of the artists were interviewed, gave talks, wrote things, showed up in the newspaper, this is the only thing we have directly from Bealey, and really expresses his view of art and nature. One of the artist's rarest privileges is to evolve from nature things more beautiful than we can grasp in the hurry of everyday life. And what makes art so important and worthy is it communicates over 100, 200 year span how people felt. And you become really in touch with the Zoarites, what their sense of this wonderful place was. And the artists, through their abilities, were able to capture it. And as we look at these paintings, really feel for them. Now, Bealey was the son of a decorator who immigrated to America in the 1880s. The father and his uncle were employed in decorating mansions along Euclid Avenue. Bealey first trained with his father, helping in decorating. Now, here's a question for everyone. Glasmorgan Castle, which is in Elias. I don't know if any of you, I didn't know, I looked it up. It's now owned by the county and you can visit it, an industrial. It's one of those things, they dismantled an Irish castle. Who doesn't do that? Brought it here, reassembled it, and the uncle and Bealey and the father decorated it. And much of the stencil work, the paintings are still there. It was stucco on the wall, many floral motifs. There was a rathskeller with gnomes, with steins drinking, and the usual things. But it's interesting that it isn't. But most of his work was up in Cleveland, but they did do that. In 1903, when Bealey was 18, he traveled to Germany to study at the Arts and Crafts School in Munich, and he became a follower of the Nouveau art style of Central Europe, which was Jugendstil. He spent a few years back, and it's interesting too, in America, early 1900s, working for, if you're an artist, Sherwin-Williams, the paint company. And we have some sketches looking over the window at the Cuyahoga River of him painting the ferries, the tugs, the barges, going back and forth. He then returned in 1911 to Europe, and it was the most wonderful time of his life. He decided he wasn't going to learn anything more in the academies, so went out with his friends in the countryside, and they painted and they drank and they drank and they painted. And it was a wonderful time. Once back in Cleveland, he got a job doing movie posters. And that was how he maintained and supported his family for the next 30 years. Two principles are influential in Bealey's work. First, the idea of abstracting from nature simplified forms. And the second is arranging these forms in rhythmic patterns. Trees are not just trees, but symbols of growth in harmony with other nature patterns, such as flowing rivers and the patterns of the winds. Some of you may know this painting. It was done twice. The original from 1920s is lost. We don't know what happened to it. It won first prize at the Cleveland Museum May Show. He did the painting again in 1940. The owner lent it generously to our show so we could have it. And you get a good feel for how everything is in harmony and in movement. We can call his art, and now we've gone from traditional academic art in the style, say, of Rembrandt, early Impressionism with the haystacks of Monet, Post-Impressionism, which has a kind of sense, a little of Van Gogh, and now what you can call this art is really rhythmic cubism. It creates the material world in flowing lines and vibrating colors. Here's some other paintings he did at that time. Now, the haystacks, you see how they've changed. And this is the brewery. What I've put here is his early painting of, I always get this, house number 1 or 2. You know, no, all right. But here's a picture of it. The tree was still here when I was able to take the painting and how it goes. And then this is one of his masterpieces. And that's the canal. And you see how everything is just in brilliant movement. You can look at it as a realist painting, you can look at it as an abstract painting, but you certainly come away with it with the feel of the times and the place. I have a number of Feely paintings. I brought a selection. There are a couple on the piano there. And then I have one here of the fields to get a sense of what he is doing. We also have, in the 1930s and 40s, especially in the 40s, he was able to stay in the cabin. I took a picture in the inside. I don't know if you can see it. Here's looking out the door. There's a shelf here. And if you look at this painting, you see, we mixed it up. We were going to do it the other way. Where is Tammy? We went back and forth which one to bring, but it doesn't matter. And here's the inside of the house with the fireplace going with the chimney. And here's the outside of the house at that time. And this is, you can't tell, I think there's John Lesser, when we found this painting up in the attic of one of the houses. I think it was the sewing house, and we cleaned it for exhibition. They did several versions. This is the large oil. He did smaller ones in pen and ink and watercolor. Okay. Moving forward. Later, Joseph Jica came to Cleveland, to Zoar. Here is Feely's work. I understand the tree is cut down now, which I was sorry to hear, I really lost it. Jica's coming in the 30s. The one thing that's very interesting is look what happened. The electrification of the town sometime in that dozen-year period. This, people thought, was like artist license, and they just made it up. But when we did this, Ohio Historical Society found a photograph that was actually there on the houses. We don't know. Maybe someone knows if that had to do with snow or the way the shingles were put on or why, but it's a wonderful decorative piece. And here we have another one of these houses. Some thinks it's the corner of 2nd Street or 3rd. I'm not sure. You have to line up sometimes the chimney and the windows. The house is now all restored. But in those times, in the 1930s, you have a sense of lost time and the bygone age. just showing how modern things went. William Brower came here in the 30s and did now your completely abstract paintings of the countryside of Zoar. And then I wanted to mention certainly the Whitmires and their wonderful art contest that they did every year. And here's just a few of these many type of paintings and scenes that the artists did. So continuing in a way the art colony to the present. Well, okay, I wanted to leave some time for discussion and for you to look at things. If there are any questions from the audience, did you want to go back on some of the